I've always learned, somebody says, well, I've been mentioned, I have a great interest in history, and the land office is evidence of that. And folks say, well, you're kind of a historian. I say, no, not exactly. Well, you're kind of an amateur historian. Well, no, not exactly. Well, you just like history. Yeah, exactly. I just like history. And I know that when I follow folks like Ed and others who have already spoken to you this morning, that don't ever try to talk about history because, you can, when you're in a crowd of strangers, you can BS people pretty easily, but when you're a crowd of experts, you cannot do that. So I'm not going to talk about history per se. And I just got here from Houston. I went to another beginning of another civil war called a wedding last night. And that was last night, so I just got back, and I've got another event to go to this afternoon. But we have some folks, you may or may not know, but the land office is now responsible for the Alamo with our allies and our good partners, the Daughters of the Republic of Texas. And we have some folks here from the Alamo. I want to point them out, some staff. Ed Wenders is here. I thought they were. Okay, there we are, down there, yes. And so if you have any questions or suggestions about our new responsibility of managing and co-managing the Shrine of Texas Liberty, please grab and talk to those folks. Later, there's going to be a cemetery tour. That's one of the breakout sessions, I believe. And I remember my first visit to the Texas State Cemetery. I think I was about 10 years old, and I had come up here with my mom, who was a realtor, and at that time, to renew your license, you had to come to Austin. So there's two things I did. One of them was, and I still have the picture of me sitting on the base of the monument to the Hood's Texas Brigade. And the other thing I did was go over to the cemetery to find the grave of my great-grandfather, James Monroe Cole. And we found it, and he was a veteran of the war between the states, the Civil War, War of Southern Rebellion, War of North, whatever you want to call it. And I always lay all those out there because I have already been criticized as being insensitive. Because in our brochure, I think somewhere we mention, the somewhat tongue-in-cheek, maybe not, description of the War of Northern Aggression. So a newspaper reporter had to make note of that and said that I was a pretty good public official, except that I was too often insensitive. So if you feel insensitive when you use anything other than whatever the term is today, the Civil War, which is, I guess, the appropriate description, as are others. But anyway, so I went over there and found the grave of my great-grandfather, James Monroe Cole, 12th Louisiana Infantry, who enlisted at Camp Moore, Louisiana in 1862 and made it until July of 63 when, probably fortunately, he was captured by the Yankees near Jackson, Mississippi, and spent the rest of the war in a POW camp in Indiana. I think it was Camp Martin, I'm not sure, Indiana. So probably, notwithstanding the stories he told about his visit as a guest of the United States Army and the rats that they ate and all of those things, probably because of that, he didn't get dissected by a mini ball or shrapnel, and I'm here. And so I want to thank the United States Army for capturing my great-grandfather and taking care of him for about 2.5 years until he was paroled and exchanged and came back to Louisiana in 1865. After that, he was kind of an honorary fellow. The family description, the oral history says that he was referred to as so honorary that if he fell in a creek, he would float upstream. He killed a man in Louisiana. We don't know much about that, but in order to evade prosecution, he came to Texas. Times were a little different, and he settled in East Texas and ultimately resided in the Texas Confederate Veterans Home here in Austin until he passed in 1919 and was buried at the State Cemetery. It's interesting, a little connection to that history. When I was in the legislature, when I was in the Senate, I authored the bill establishing Texas Veterans Homes, modern day Texas Veterans Homes, and it was kind of a connection to the past because we now have 8 state veterans homes, and that was the first set of veterans homes since the Confederate Veterans Home closed, I believe in the 1940s. Of course, by that time, I believe it was Spanish-American War veterans and other veterans, and maybe a few Civil War veterans in there. So we passed the bill, and when I was passing the bill on the floor of the legislature, I had a picture of the Confederate Veterans Home, and my crusty, honorary great-grandfather with a beard down to his belly button sitting on a ladder-back chair somewhere near Hemphill, Texas. So history connects us, and history is directly related to what we do today. He was, and I describe when I talk about military service in our family, 5 consecutive generations of wartime service overseas. And as Mark stumbled, he said something about serving in the United States Army. He had to correct himself. Well, there's 4 that served on the U.S. side, and Grandpa Cole was, of course, on the Confederate side. And he really wasn't overseas, except being from Louisiana and being captured in Mississippi was probably overseas enough for him. But it's a fascinating story, and it's all oral history, although I have found some documentation of what he did, and it's a pretty fascinating story. We have a lot of things to learn from our past. I know I encounter those those opportunities almost every day. About 3 weeks ago, I was kind of embroiled in a controversy because, as you know, the General Land Office, main responsibility is managing the permanent school fund, generating income for public education. Well, I was involved in a controversy about money that we make and how much we should retain for investment and how much we should pass to the legislature to spend directly on education. This has been a constant tension. But in that discussion, I was able to make reference to a historical connection about where the demand for money now, as opposed to leaving the money in the corpus of the permanent school fund and letting it grow, did not turn out so well. In 1862, I believe it was, we had a permanent school fund. However, it was rated to help pay for the Texas commitment to the war between the states. And I often use that as an example. See, the legislature has rated the fund before, for example, in 1862, and that didn't turn out so well. That example is directly related to today. We have a constant tension about how much money should go for direct expenditure and how much money should go in the corpus of the fund. So history is something that benefits us every day. There is nothing that occurs in today's public discourse that hasn't occurred before. And of course, my favorite story about public discourse, and it's humorous and I'm not quite sure it's true, that's why I always say I'm not a historian, just a guy interested in history, is we have an issue today in Texas and across the nation about, we have education system that now has the responsibility of educating children from many different backgrounds and many different languages. And of course, we have a discussion and a controversy about how do we teach children who are primary Spanish speakers. And today we use terms like, shall we use the bilingual method or do we use the immersion method? They had the same discussion in the 1920s. They didn't use the terms bilingual and immersion. They just said, shall we teach them in English or shall we teach them in Spanish? And we had a governor at the time who was our first lady governor. Of course, we're not talking about Ann Richards. We're talking about Miriam A. Ferguson, Ma Ferguson, who became governor after her husband had been impeached and removed from office for a variety of things. In fact, one of the things that Pa Ferguson, James E. Ferguson, was accused of doing was selling pardons. And it got to be such a joke around Texas that it was said that if you ever bumped into Ma Ferguson and said, "Pardon me," she would say, "Oh, no, you have to talk to my husband about that." I don't know if that's true. I don't know if it's true, but it makes a hell of a good story. But not as good as the other story that I love to tell about Ma Ferguson. Again, I've heard this, I've read it, but I don't know if it's true or not. It makes a great story. But Ma Ferguson was asked while she was governor, I think about 1922, what we should do about children who are primary Spanish speakers. What do we do? And she responded by what I believe, if it's true, and if it's not true, it's still the most infamous quote in Texas political history when asked about how do we teach children who are primary Spanish speakers. She replied by saying, if English was good enough for Jesus Christ, It's good enough for the school children of Texas. See, that's what's good about not being a historian. You have the liberty. You have the liberty to tell things that maybe, have some basis in fact, but anyway, this is one of the things we do at the Texas General Land Office. We have a wonderful archives of 35 million documents, and I know y'all are going to go tour them a little bit later today. I'm the hair on the back of my neck stands up every time I venture into those rooms and see those documents. It'll bring a tear to your eye and make your pulse quicken to know that we are the custodian of some documents that have been touched by heroes, maybe a few scoundrels, some patriots, and some folks that were just average people. And not only do we also have the Texas State Libraries and Archives outfit, and they've got some wonderful documents over there. Their collection exceeds ours, but we've got some pretty iconic documents. So I hope everybody's learning something today. I know I learned something. I've read Ed's book, and I've read the books of some of the other speakers here. I give copies away from time to time, and it's a part of our history that we can learn from, that we shouldn't be ashamed of, that we don't need to be defensive about, that we can openly discuss, and nobody needs to say we're insensitive. Because we're very sensitive. We're sensitive to the link between the past and the future and the present. So thank you very much. I know y'all are going to have a good rest of the day, and God bless Texas.